A coffee shop in London handles more insurance claims than most countries' entire economies. Not a corporation, not a government agency, not even a traditional insurance company. A 338-year-old marketplace that started when ship captains needed someone to bet their cargo wouldn't sink. Today, Lloyd's of London insures $60 billion worth of risks annually. Everything from satellite launches to celebrity body parts to cyber attacks on Fortune 500 companies. Here's what nobody tells you. Lloyd's doesn't actually insure anything. They're a marketplace where wealthy individuals risk their personal fortunes betting on disasters that won't happen. When a hurricane destroys a city, when a tanker explodes, when a pandemic shuts down the global economy, someone at Lloyd's pays out, and they're personally liable for every penny, down to their last house and car. The Titanic sinking? Lloyd's paid $5 million in 1912, roughly $150 million today. The World Trade Center attack? Lloyd's paid out $9 billion. Deepwater Horizon oil spill? $600 million from Lloyd's. COVID-19 business interruption? They're still paying, with claims exceeding $4 billion and counting. But what most people don't know is how they actually survived. Because Lloyd's has nearly collapsed 3 times. In the 1980s, asbestos claims bankrupted hundreds of members. In the 1990s, a fraud scandal destroyed thousands of personal fortunes. In the 2000s, Hurricane Katrina almost broke the entire system. Yet Lloyd's is still here, bigger than ever, insuring risks no one else will touch. And the secret isn't better risk management or smarter underwriting. It's a 338-year-old system where individual humans stake everything they own on mathematical probabilities about future disasters. This is the story of how a coffee shop became a $50 billion empire by convincing wealthy people to gamble their entire net worth on catastrophes. Bruce Carnegie Brown is chairman of Lloyd's of London, and he can't actually tell you what Lloyd's insures. Not because it's secret, because the list is literally too long. Lloyd's underwrites roughly 25% of global specialty insurance. The weird, complex, impossible-to-price risks that normal insurance companies won't touch. A film production losing $200 million because the lead actor dies mid-shoot. Lloyd's, a satellite worth $400 million exploding on the launch pad. Lloyd's, a shipping company losing $2 billion in cargo when a container ship blocks the Suez Canal. Lloyd's, they've insured Bruce Springsteen's voice for $6 million, insured a ghost hunting equipment manufacturer against actually finding a ghost, insured against alien abduction, meteorite strikes, and immaculate conception. If there's a bizarre risk someone will pay to transfer, Lloyd's will find someone willing to bet it won't happen. This isn't how insurance normally works. Most people buy insurance from companies, State Farm, Geico, AIG. Those are corporations with shareholders, executives, and capital reserves. Lloyd's is none of those things. It's a marketplace, like a stock exchange, where individual investors and syndicates compete to underwrite risks. What most people don't know is that Lloyd's wasn't designed to be an insurance market. It was an accident that started in 1686. That's when Edward Lloyd opened a coffee shop on Tower Street in London. Just a coffee shop. He served coffee, sold newspapers, hosted merchants. Nothing special. Except for one detail, Lloyd's Coffee House was located near the Thames River docks, where ships departed for months-long voyages carrying millions in cargo. Ship owners had a problem. They'd load vessels with silk from China, spices from Indonesia, sugar from the Caribbean, fortunes in goods traveling through storms, pirates, and uncharted waters. If the ship sank, they lost everything. They needed someone to share the risk. So they started making bets in Lloyd's Coffee House. A ship captain would announce his route and cargo. Wealthy merchants would examine the ship, assess the captain's competence, and literally write their names under the ship's details, pledging to cover a percentage of losses if the ship sank. The term underwriter comes from physically writing your name underneath the risk description. Behind this casual betting system was something revolutionary: distributed risk. Instead of one person betting the whole ship would survive, dozens of people would each bet small amounts. If the ship sank, losses were spread. If it didn't, everyone who bet on survival kept the premiums. By 1688, Lloyd's Coffee House was the centre of London's shipping insurance market. But it was completely informal. No regulations, no licenses, no corporate structure. Just wealthy men drinking coffee and staking their fortunes on probabilities. This informality was both Lloyd's greatest strength and its fatal weakness. The strength, anyone with capital could underwrite risk, so the market grew explosively. The weakness, anyone with capital could underwrite risk, including incompetent gamblers who destroyed themselves and their investors. By 1769, Lloyd's had moved to the Royal Exchange Building and started keeping official records. By 1811, they'd excluded non-members from the trading floor. By 1871, they'd incorporated as the Society and Corporation of Lloyd's, not an insurance company, but a marketplace where insurance happened. Here's what makes Lloyd's different from every other financial institution: unlimited liability. When you invest in most businesses, you risk only what you invest. Invest $100,000 in Apple stock. The most you can lose is $100,000. At Lloyd's, if you underwrite risk and claims exceed your investment, you're personally liable for the difference. Your house, your savings, your retirement fund, everything can be seized to pay claims. This creates perverse incentives: unlimited upside when risks don't materialize, unlimited downside when they do. And for 200 years, this system worked brilliantly because catastrophic claims were rare enough that premiums outpaced losses. Then the 20th century happened. 2 world wars, the Titanic, the Hindenburg, major earthquakes, hurricanes, and industrial disasters, and Lloyd's discovered that their entire business model depended on disasters remaining statistically rare. Edward Lloyd opened his coffee shop in 1686 on Tower Street, 4 years after London's coffee houses had been declared dens of sedition by King Charles II. The king had tried to ban coffee houses entirely in 1675, claiming they spread rumors and fomented rebellion. The ban lasted 11 days before merchants revolted, and the king backed down. Coffee houses were too economically important to London's commercial life. Lloyd's Coffee House wasn't the first. London already had over 500 coffee houses by 1686. What made Lloyd's different was location, 300 yards from the Thames River docks, where ships loaded cargo bound for colonies, trading posts, and ports across the world. Lloyd understood his customer base: ship captains, cargo owners, merchants, shipbuilders. They all needed information. Lloyd started collecting ship departure schedules, cargo manifests, and news from returning vessels. He posted this information on the coffeehouse walls. If you wanted to know which ships were sailing when, you came to Lloyd's. This information aggregation created a natural marketplace. Ship owners wanted to transfer risk, wealthy merchants wanted investment returns, and they both trusted each other enough to make informal agreements over coffee. The first recorded maritime insurance transaction at Lloyd's Coffee House happened in 1688. A merchant named Richard Watts was shipping $2,000 worth of textiles to Jamaica aboard the merchant vessel Dolphin. Watts approached several wealthy patrons in Lloyd's and offered them a deal. Pay him $200 each now, 10% premium, and if the ship sank, they'd cover their share of the $2,000 cargo loss. 10 merchants took the bet. They literally signed their names on a piece of paper describing the voyage, each pledging $200 in coverage. The paper was called a slip, and the men who signed it were underwriters. The Dolphin made it to Jamaica and back. The 10 underwriters kept their $200 premiums, a 100% return in 6 months. Watts paid $2,000 for insurance, but kept his cargo safe. You see, this was pure gambling dressed up as risk management. The underwriters were betting the ship would survive. Watts was buying peace of mind. Both sides believed they got the better deal. What's interesting is how quickly this informal system developed sophisticated mechanisms. By 1690, Lloyd's Coffee House had established standardized insurance contracts called policies. These policies specified exactly what was covered: ship loss, cargo damage, piracy, storm damage. They created legal language that's still used in insurance contracts today. The policies also introduced the concept of general average. If a ship had to jettison cargo during a storm to save the vessel, all cargo owners shared the loss proportionally. This prevented captains from saving only the most valuable cargo and throwing everything else overboard. Lloyd's also pioneered the no cure, no pay salvage rule. If someone saved a sinking ship and its cargo, they got paid a percentage of the saved value, but if they failed to save it, they got nothing. This incentivized dramatic rescue attempts while preventing fraudulent salvage operations. By 1696, Lloyd's Coffee House was handling roughly $500,000 in insured cargo annually, about $150 million in today's money. Edward Lloyd was getting rich not from underwriting risk, but from selling coffee to people who did. He charged no fees for using his coffee house as a marketplace. His profit came from selling coffee, food, and newspapers to hundreds of daily customers. But Lloyd had created something more valuable than a coffee business. He'd created a network. Ship captains trusted Lloyd's information. Underwriters trusted each other's assessments. Cargo owners trusted the system would pay out. This trust network was worth more than any individual transaction. When Edward Lloyd died in 1713, the coffee house continued operating under his name. His widow ran it for a decade, then sold it to other operators who maintained the Lloyd's brand. By 1720, Lloyd's Coffee House was synonymous with maritime insurance in London. But the system had a critical flaw: no oversight. Anyone with money could become an underwriter, and some underwriters were taking on more risk than they could possibly cover. In 1720, the South Sea bubble collapsed, a speculative financial crisis that destroyed fortunes across Britain. Several Lloyd's underwriters had invested heavily in South Sea Company stock. When the bubble burst, they couldn't pay their insurance claims. Ships sank, cargo was lost, and the underwriters declared bankruptcy. Cargo owners who'd paid premiums received nothing. The informal trust system collapsed. For several years, ship owners avoided Lloyd's entirely, turning to formal insurance corporations that were emerging in London. Lloyd's Coffee House nearly went extinct, but it survived because of one innovation that formal corporations couldn't replicate: unlimited liability. The new generation of Lloyd's underwriters made an explicit promise: we will pay every legitimate claim, even if it bankrupts us personally. This wasn't just marketing, it was legally enforceable. If you underwriting shipping insurance at Lloyd's, creditors could seize your personal assets to satisfy claims. This unlimited liability promise restored trust. By 1730, Lloyd's was again London's premier maritime insurance marketplace, but the unlimited liability principle would haunt Lloyd's for the next 290 years, creating fortunes and destroying lives in equal measure. Here's what most people miss about this era. Lloyd's wasn't just insuring ships. They were creating the foundational tools of modern capitalism: standardized contracts, risk assessment frameworks, legal precedents for claims disputes, statistical analysis of maritime disasters. By 1760, Lloyd's underwriters were keeping detailed records of every ship insured, every claim paid, and every loss cause. They were building actuarial tables, statistical models predicting how often ships sank, where they sank, and why. This data gave Lloyd's underwriters an information advantage over competitors. A Lloyd's underwriter in 1760 knew that ships sailing to the Caribbean had a 12% loss rate due to hurricanes. Ships sailing to India had an 8% loss rate from monsoons and pirates. Ships sailing to Africa had a 15% loss rate from disease-killing crew and cargo spoilage. They could price insurance premiums accordingly. This data-driven approach transformed gambling into calculated risk-taking. Lloyd's wasn't just betting anymore. They were making informed predictions based on centuries of accumulated knowledge. But data can't predict everything. And in 1782, Lloyd's faced its first existential crisis when a risk they thought they understood proved catastrophic. The Revolutionary War nearly destroyed Lloyd's in 1782. British ships were being captured by American privateers, privately owned warships authorized by the Continental Congress to attack British merchant vessels. Lloyd's underwriters had priced their policies assuming normal piracy rates of 2 to 3% of voyages. American privateers were capturing 15% of British ships crossing the Atlantic. Claims exploded. In 1781 alone, Lloyd's paid out $800,000 in privateer capture claims, roughly $250 million today. Many underwriters couldn't cover their exposure. They declared bankruptcy, leaving cargo owners with unpaid claims. The crisis revealed a fundamental problem. Lloyd's had no capital reserves. When an insurance company takes in premiums, they're supposed to set aside reserves to pay future claims. Lloyd's underwriters were spending premiums immediately, gambling that claims would remain manageable. In 1782, a group of Lloyd's senior underwriters created the Committee for Managing the Affairs of Lloyd's Coffee House. This wasn't a governing body. Lloyd's remained fiercely independent, but it was a coordination mechanism. The committee established basic rules. Underwriters had to prove minimum financial capacity, maintain records, and submit to audits. More importantly, the committee created the Central Fund, a shared reserve where all underwriters contributed a percentage of premiums. If an individual underwriter went bankrupt, the Central Fund would cover their outstanding claims. This protected cargo owners while maintaining the unlimited liability principle for underwriters. The Central Fund was revolutionary. It transformed Lloyd's from a collection of individual gamblers into a coordinated marketplace with collective responsibility. Ship owners could trust that claims would be paid even if individual underwriters failed. By 1785, Lloyd's had restored its reputation and was again dominating maritime insurance. But the Revolutionary War crisis had taught a lesson. Trust required institutional backing, not just individual promises. In 1811, Lloyd's took another step toward institutionalization. They excluded non-members from the underwriting room. Previously, anyone could walk into Lloyd's Coffee House and underwrite risk. Now you needed to be approved by existing members, a vetting process that ensured basic competence and financial capacity. This created an exclusive club. Getting into Lloyd's required sponsorship from 2 existing members, proof of substantial wealth, and a track record in maritime commerce. It was self-regulating capitalism. The market participants themselves decided who could compete. But exclusivity created another problem: stagnation. By 1820, Lloyd's membership had ossified into a small group of wealthy families who inherited underwriting positions from their fathers. They weren't innovating. They weren't adapting to changing maritime technology. They were coasting on reputation. Then steamships arrived, and Lloyd's underwriters, who'd spent 140 years perfecting sailing ship risk assessment, had no idea how to price steam-powered vessel insurance. Steamships were faster, more reliable, and less dependent on weather. But they also had boilers that exploded, mechanical systems that failed, and coal fires that spread. Were steamships safer or more dangerous than sailing ships? Lloyd's data couldn't answer that question because steamships were too new. Conservative Lloyd's underwriters refused to insure steamships at all. They'd built their fortunes on sailing ship expertise. Why take risks on unproven technology? For a decade, steamship owners had to seek insurance from smaller, newer insurance companies willing to experiment. This conservatism almost killed Lloyd's. By 1850, steamships were rapidly replacing sailing ships. Lloyd's market share was collapsing because they'd refused to adapt. A new generation of Lloyd's underwriters, led by a merchant named Henry Hosier, forced change. Hosier argued that Lloyd's needed to evolve or die. He commissioned engineering studies of steamship safety, hired naval architects to assess boiler risks, and developed new actuarial models for mechanical failures. By 1860, Lloyd's was again the premier maritime insurer, now covering both sailing ships and steamships. But the steamship crisis had revealed something important. Lloyd's greatest strength, deep expertise in traditional risks, was also its weakness when new risks emerged. This pattern would repeat throughout Lloyd's history. Airplanes, automobiles, satellites, cybersecurity, every new technology created an information gap where Lloyd's traditional expertise was useless. What made Lloyd's survive each transition was its marketplace structure. Unlike insurance companies where executives made centralized decisions, Lloyd's had hundreds of independent underwriters making individual choices. Some were conservative and stuck with proven risks. Others were aggressive and experimented with new ones. The market rewarded accurate risk assessment and punished poor judgment. This evolutionary approach meant Lloyd's could adapt without top-down direction. Conservative underwriters would gradually retire or go bankrupt. Innovative underwriters would gain market share and train successors. The institution evolved through natural selection. But natural selection is brutal. And between 1850 and 1900, Dozens of Lloyd's underwriters went bankrupt trying to price risks they didn't understand. Their personal fortunes were seized, their families were financially destroyed, and other underwriters learned from their mistakes. This is the dark side of Lloyd's that rarely gets discussed. The unlimited liability system created spectacular successes and devastating failures. For every underwriter who became wealthy, another lost everything. And the losses were total, not just investment capital but homes, savings, inheritances. By 1871, Lloyd's had grown large enough that Parliament formalized its legal status. The Lloyd's Act of 1871 incorporated Lloyd's as the Society and Corporation of Lloyd's, though it clarified that Lloyd's itself was not an insurance company. It was a marketplace where insurance transactions happened. This legal status gave Lloyd's legitimacy and protection, but it also created expectations. If Lloyd's was going to be Britain's premier insurance marketplace, it needed to behave responsibly. That meant better regulation, more transparency, and accountability when things went wrong. The Society of Lloyd's created the Lloyd's Policy Signing Office, a central authority that standardized policy language and maintained records. They established the Lloyd's Intelligence Department, which collected information about ship movements, accidents, and maritime conditions worldwide. By 1900, Lloyd's had offices in major ports around the world: New York, Singapore, Hong Kong, Cape Town, all feeding information back to London. This global intelligence network gave Lloyd's underwriters better data than any competitor. But data couldn't prepare them for what was coming, because in 1912 Lloyd's would face a claim so large it threatened the entire marketplace. A luxury ocean liner carrying millionaires hitting an iceberg in the North Atlantic, the Titanic. The Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. By 9 a.m. that same morning, Lloyd's underwriters knew they were facing the largest maritime insurance claim in history. The ship was insured for $1 million, roughly $150 million today. The cargo was insured separately for another $500,000, and there were death benefit claims for crew and passengers, totaling another $200,000. Lloyd's exposure was roughly $1.7 million total. That's $250 million in today's money. And it had to be paid immediately. Here's what most people don't know about the Titanic claim. Lloyd's paid every penny within 30 days. No investigation delays, no legal challenges, no disputes over policy language. The Titanic sank, the policies were valid, Lloyd's paid. This wasn't generosity, it was survival. Lloyd's reputation depended on fast, full payment of legitimate claims. If they delayed or disputed the Titanic claim, ship owners worldwide would lose faith in the market. But paying that fast required something remarkable: coordination among 68 different underwriters who'd each taken small pieces of Titanic risk. Some had insured the hull, others had insured cargo. Still others had written death benefit policies. All had to assess their exposure, verify claims, and pay out simultaneously. The Lloyd's Policy Signing Office became a coordination center. They calculated each underwriter's proportional liability, verified that all had sufficient capital, and arranged payments. It was early 20th century fintech, coordinating complex financial transactions across multiple parties, without computers, internet, or even telephones in many cases. The Titanic claim cost several Lloyd's underwriters their fortunes. They'd underwritten too much Titanic risk relative to their capital. When the claim came due, they paid, bankrupting themselves in the process. Their personal assets were liquidated. Some lost country estates, others lost family businesses. But their losses protected Lloyd's reputation. Ship owners saw that Lloyd's honored its commitments even when individual underwriters were destroyed. That trust was worth more than the $1.7 million paid out. What's fascinating is what Lloyd's learned from Titanic. The disaster revealed that underwriters had been concentrating risk, multiple underwriters insuring the same ship because it was prestigious. When Titanic sank, the losses weren't distributed across Lloyd's whole marketplace. They were concentrated among underwriters who'd competed to insure the unsinkable ship. After Titanic, Lloyd's implemented accumulation controls, limits on how much total exposure the marketplace could have to any single risk. If a ship had already been insured for 50% of its value by Lloyd's underwriters, additional underwriters would be discouraged from taking more exposure. This was self-regulation emerging from catastrophic loss. No government-mandated accumulation controls. Lloyd's underwriters recognized that unlimited liability required risk distribution, and they voluntarily adopted rules to prevent concentration. By 1914, when World War I started, Lloyd's had become the world's largest insurance marketplace. They'd insured over 70% of global shipping, handled policies worth $500 million annually, and had proven they could survive catastrophic claims. Then the war began, and Lloyd's faced a question they'd never confronted. How do you insure ships during a war where submarines deliberately sink merchant vessels? Traditional maritime insurance covered perils of the sea, storms, pirates, accidents. War was explicitly excluded from most policies. Ship owners sailing into war zones were uninsured. This was economically catastrophic for Britain, which depended on maritime trade for food, fuel, and military supplies. The British government approached Lloyd's with a proposal. We'll guarantee war risk insurance if Lloyd's underwrites it. The government would cover any losses exceeding Lloyd's capital, but Lloyd's would handle the administrative work and take the first layer of risk. Lloyd's agreed. By 1915, they'd created the War Risk Insurance Office, a public-private partnership where Lloyd's underwriters assessed ship safety, the government paid catastrophic claims, and both shared in premiums. This partnership was brilliant. The government got Lloyd's expertise without building a bureaucracy, Lloyd's got government backing without giving up independence, and ship owners got insurance that let them keep sailing during the war. Between 1914 and 1918, Lloyd's War Risk Insurance Office insured over 10,000 ships. German U-boats sank approximately 5,000 merchant vessels during the war. Lloyd's paid claims exceeding $50 million, roughly $5 billion today. The government covered most of it, but Lloyd's took losses on their share. What most people miss is that World War I transformed Lloyd's business model. Before the war, Lloyd's was purely maritime insurance. After the war, they'd proven they could handle aviation insurance for military planes, casualty insurance for sailors, and political risk insurance for war exposure. By 1920, Lloyd's was insuring things that had nothing to do with ships: factory fires, automobile accidents, airplane crashes, even celebrity insurance. They insured silent film stars against injuries that would prevent filming. This diversification made Lloyd's more resilient, but also more complex. Maritime underwriters understood ships. They didn't necessarily understand factories, cars, or airplanes. Lloyd's was entering markets where their historical data advantage didn't exist. Between 1920 and 1950, Lloyd's membership exploded. The number of underwriters increased from 200 to over 6,000. Many were names, wealthy individuals who pledged their fortunes to back underwriting syndicates, but didn't personally assess risks. They hired professional underwriters to make decisions while providing capital. This separation of capital from expertise created new problems. Professional underwriters were making decisions with other people's money. If they mispriced risks, the names lost fortunes, not the underwriters making the decisions. The name system worked beautifully when risks were accurately priced. Names collected steady returns without doing any work, passive income from their pledge of capital. But when risks were mispriced, names faced unlimited liability for decisions they didn't make. Between 1950 and 1980, being a Lloyd's name was considered one of the best investments available to wealthy British families. Annual returns averaged 15 to 20%. Losses were rare and manageable. Thousands of wealthy individuals joined as names, pledging millions in collective capital. Then asbestos happened, and Lloyd's discovered that unlimited liability combined with long-tail risks could destroy the entire marketplace. World War II made Lloyd's obscenely profitable, while simultaneously revealing risks that wouldn't materialize for 40 years. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, Lloyd's again partnered with the government to provide war risk insurance. But this time, the scale was unprecedented. Not just ships, entire industries needed coverage. Factories making munitions, airfields, civilian infrastructure in bombing targets. The British government created the War Damage Insurance Scheme, administered by Lloyd's. Every property owner in Britain could purchase insurance against bomb damage at subsidized rates. The government covered catastrophic losses, Lloyd's handled claims processing, and underwriters took a small percentage of premiums for administrative work. This was essentially free money for Lloyd's. They collected fees without bearing real risk. The government covered all major claims. Between 1939 and 1945, Lloyd's processed over 400,000 war damage claims, totaling $150 million, earning roughly $15 million in fees. But Lloyd's also made money on private insurance that the government didn't guarantee. They insured merchant ships running supplies to Britain through U-boat-infested waters. They insured aircraft manufacturers against production failures. They insured munitions factories against explosions. The profit margins were spectacular. A merchant ship crossing the Atlantic in 1942 paid premiums equivalent to 30% of cargo value for a single voyage. Many ships were insured for multiple voyages per year. Lloyd's underwriters were earning 100% plus annual returns on war risk premiums. One Lloyd's syndicate leader, Cuthbert Heath, became legendary for his war risk underwriting. He developed statistical models predicting U-boat attack patterns based on moon phases, weather conditions, and convoy routes. His models were so accurate that the British Admiralty consulted him when planning convoy schedules. Heath's syndicate earned over $5 million in profits during World War II, roughly $300 million today. He became one of Britain's wealthiest men by betting on ships surviving while thousands of sailors died in the Atlantic. This is the moral complexity of insurance. Lloyd's profited from war while contributing to Britain's survival. Without Lloyd's insurance, merchant ships wouldn't have sailed. Without merchant ships, Britain would have starved. Lloyd's was simultaneously war profiteering and enabling resistance to Nazi Germany. But World War II also created risks that wouldn't be understood for decades. During the war, shipyards used asbestos extensively for fireproofing and insulation. Factories making military equipment used asbestos in machinery. Construction projects for airfields and bunkers used asbestos in building materials. Lloyd's underwriters insured all of this. They wrote general liability policies covering shipyard workers, factory employees, and construction crews. These policies promised to cover any workplace injuries or illnesses arising from insured operations. At the time, asbestos was considered safe. It was fireproof, cheap, and versatile. Some health concerns existed, but they were dismissed as minor risks affecting only workers with decades of heavy exposure. Lloyd's underwriters priced general liability policies, assuming asbestos would never generate significant claims. They were catastrophically wrong, and they wouldn't discover their mistake until the 1980s, when asbestos disease claims exploded and nearly destroyed Lloyd's entirely. After World War II ended, Lloyd's continued its expansion into new insurance markets. They insured the first commercial jet aircraft, insured satellite launches, insured nuclear power plants, insured oil tankers carrying millions of barrels through politically unstable regions. By 1960, Lloyd's was handling roughly $2 billion in annual premiums, about $50 billion today. They'd become the world's premier marketplace for complex, unusual, and catastrophic risks that standard insurance companies wouldn't touch. The name system exploded during this period. Joining Lloyd's as a name became a status symbol among Britain's upper class. You needed a minimum net worth of $100,000, about $3 million today, to qualify. Once accepted, you pledged your wealth to back underwriting syndicates and collected annual returns. Between 1960 and 1980, Lloyd's recruited over 30,000 names. These weren't insurance professionals. They were doctors, lawyers, aristocrats, and business owners who wanted passive investment income. They trusted Lloyd's underwriters to manage risk while they collected checks. This trust was misplaced. Some underwriters were excellent, others were reckless, and names had almost no ability to distinguish between them. They were assigned to syndicates based on sponsorship and connections, not performance analysis. The really problematic development was the emergence of working names, Lloyd's insiders, who became names in their own syndicates. This created conflicts of interest. An underwriter could make risky decisions, knowing that external names would bear most losses, while the underwriter collected salary and bonuses. By 1970, roughly 40% of Lloyd's underwriters were also names in their own syndicates. They were playing with other people's money while protecting their own positions. This moral hazard was a disaster waiting to happen. The warning signs were visible to anyone paying attention. Lloyd's was insuring long-tail risks, policies where claims might not emerge for decades, while calculating profitability based on short-term results. An underwriter could write terrible policies in 1970, collect bonuses for apparent profitability, and be retired by 1990 when claims actually materialized. Asbestos was the most dramatic example, but it wasn't alone. Pollution liability, product liability, and medical malpractice insurance all had long-tail characteristics. Lloyd's was writing policies without knowing the true risk, collecting premiums immediately, and assuming future claims would remain manageable. Some Lloyd's insiders warned about this. A 1974 internal report flagged asbestos as a potential catastrophic risk, noting that American courts were starting to award large damages to asbestos victims. The report recommended either excluding asbestos from policies or massively increasing reserves for future claims. Lloyd's leadership ignored the report. Excluding asbestos would mean losing business to competitors. Increasing reserves would reduce reported profits and anger names who expected high returns. Easier to assume everything would be fine. By 1980, Lloyd's was sitting on billions in latent asbestos liability that hadn't been properly reserved. They didn't know it yet, but the institution was essentially insolvent. Future claims would exceed available capital by orders of magnitude. And then the claims started arriving. In 1982, a Lloyd's underwriter named Dick Oathwaite received a claim for $50,000 from a shipyard worker dying of mesothelioma, a cancer caused exclusively by asbestos exposure. The claim was valid. Lloyd's had insured the shipyard's liability in the 1950s. The worker had been exposed to asbestos during World War II shipbuilding. 35 years later, he was dying. Oathwaite's syndicate owed $50,000, but Oathwaite did something unusual. He started investigating how many similar claims might exist. He hired epidemiologists to study asbestos disease patterns. He reviewed Lloyd's policy archives to determine total asbestos exposure. What he discovered was apocalyptic. Lloyd's had insured thousands of asbestos operations between 1940 and 1980. Millions of workers had been exposed. Asbestos diseases had latency periods of 20 to 50 years, meaning claims would continue arriving until 2030, and American courts were awarding damages averaging $500,000 per claim. Oathwaite calculated that his syndicate alone faced potential claims exceeding $2 billion, 50 times his syndicate's total capital, and his syndicate represented only a fraction of Lloyd's total asbestos exposure. Lloyd's total asbestos liability was potentially $50 billion or more. Against capital reserves of roughly $10 billion, Lloyd's was insolvent, and most names didn't know it yet. The crisis unfolded slowly. In 1982, asbestos claims at Lloyd's totaled $200 million. In 1983, they reached $400 million. In 1984, $800 million. The growth was exponential, and there was no end in sight. Names started receiving bills, not dividend checks, bills demanding they pay additional capital to cover losses. Many names had never received a bill before. They'd been collecting passive income for decades. Now Lloyd's was demanding hundreds of thousands of pounds to cover asbestos claims. Some names paid, others refused, arguing they'd been misled about risks. Still others simply didn't have the money. Their net worth was tied up in real estate and businesses that couldn't be quickly liquidated. Lloyd's response was brutal. Unlimited liability means unlimited. If a name couldn't pay, Lloyd's would seize their assets. Homes were sold, businesses were liquidated, retirement savings were confiscated. Some names were left financially destroyed, living in council housing after losing everything. The human cost was staggering. A 1988 investigation by The Guardian documented over 200 names who'd lost their homes to asbestos claims. Dozens committed suicide, families were destroyed, and the claims kept coming. By 1989, Lloyd's faced a full-blown crisis. Names were refusing to pay, forming action groups and suing Lloyd's for fraud and misrepresentation. They argued that Lloyd's underwriters had known about asbestos risks, but concealed them to keep collecting premiums. The lawsuits revealed damning evidence. Internal Lloyd's documents from the 1970s showed that senior underwriters had discussed asbestos risks but decided not to increase reserves. Some underwriters had quietly moved their personal capital out of asbestos-exposed syndicates while leaving external names exposed. This was insider trading applied to insurance. Lloyd's insiders had protected themselves while letting external names absorb catastrophic losses. The fraud was systemic and deliberate. In 1992, Lloyd's attempted a settlement. They created Equitas, a special company that would assume all pre-1993 insurance liabilities, including asbestos claims. Names would pay a one-time assessment to capitalize Equitas, then be released from future claims. The settlement required names to contribute roughly $10 billion collectively, an average of $500,000 per name. Many couldn't pay. Lloyd's offered financing, borrow the money, secured by your remaining assets, and pay it back over time with interest. Thousands of names took the financing deal. They had no choice. Refusing meant Lloyd's would seize their assets anyway. By 1996, Equitas was operational and names were theoretically protected from future asbestos claims. But the damage was done. Lloyd's reputation was destroyed. Their unlimited liability system had been exposed as a catastrophic risk for individual investors, and thousands of wealthy families had been financially ruined. Between 1988 and 1996, Lloyd's paid out over $40 billion in asbestos-related claims. Most of that came from names' personal assets. Some names lost everything: homes, businesses, inheritances. Others survived but were financially crippled. The asbestos crisis revealed fundamental problems with Lloyd's business model. Unlimited liability worked when risks were well understood and properly priced. But when underwriters mispriced long-tail risks, the losses were catastrophic and inescapable. Lloyd's needed to reform or die. And in 1993 they began the most dramatic restructuring in their 307-year history. While Lloyd's was dealing with asbestos claims, an even bigger scandal was unfolding inside the marketplace. Peter Cameron Webb was a Lloyd's underwriter who'd been managing syndicates since 1967. By 1980, his syndicates controlled over $500 million in premiums, making him one of Lloyd's most powerful figures. He was charming, connected, and apparently brilliant at picking profitable risks. What nobody knew was that Cameron Webb was running a fraud. He was deliberately writing bad policies, hiding losses, and funneling money to offshore accounts. His scheme worked like this. Cameron Webb would insure high-risk operations at low premiums, making his syndicates appear profitable. When claims arrived, he'd reinsure them with shell companies he secretly controlled. The shell companies would accept the claims, then declare bankruptcy without paying. The losses disappeared from his syndicate's books. Meanwhile, Cameron Webb was collecting fees, bonuses, and salary based on his syndicate's apparent profitability. He bought homes in Switzerland and the Bahamas, maintained yachts, lived like a billionaire on money stolen from names in his syndicates. The fraud lasted from 1976 until 1982, when an auditor noticed that several of Cameron Webb's reinsurance companies had identical addresses in Bermuda, all post office boxes. Investigation revealed that these weren't real insurance companies. They were just names on paper, used to hide losses. By the time Lloyd's discovered the fraud, Cameron Webb had stolen an estimated $600 million, as roughly $2 billion today. He'd fled Britain and was living in a villa outside Geneva, protected by Swiss banking laws that prevented extradition for financial crimes. Lloyd sued Cameron Webb, but Swiss courts ruled that his theft was a civil matter, not subject to criminal extradition. He kept his stolen fortune, living comfortably in exile, while the names in his syndicates faced financial ruin. The Cameron Webb scandal revealed that Lloyd's had almost no fraud prevention systems. Underwriters self-reported their results. Audits were superficial and infrequent. There was no centralized oversight of reinsurance transactions. The marketplace operated on trust, and trust was being systematically exploited. But Cameron Webb wasn't alone. Between 1982 and 1990, Lloyd's uncovered over 30 separate fraud cases involving underwriters hiding losses, inflating premiums, and stealing from names. Total losses exceeded $3 billion. The common pattern: working names. Underwriters who were also names in their own syndicates would protect themselves by putting bad risks into syndicates dominated by external names. They'd keep good risks in syndicates where they had personal exposure. This was called syndicate churning, and it was epidemic. Investigations found that roughly 40% of Lloyd's working names had engaged in some form of churning between 1975 and 1990. They were systematically transferring risk from themselves to external names. The names revolted. In 1990, over 3,000 names formed the Lloyd's Names Association and filed a massive lawsuit alleging fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and racketeering. They demanded $10 billion in damages. Lloyd's fought the lawsuit for 6 years. The legal battle revealed internal documents showing that Lloyd's leadership had known about churning but failed to stop it. Some Lloyd's officials had personally benefited from the fraud. In 1996, Lloyd's settled the lawsuit for $5 billion. But that settlement came with conditions. Names had to accept the Equitas deal covering asbestos claims, drop all fraud allegations, and sign releases preventing future lawsuits. It was a hostage negotiation disguised as a settlement. Lloyd's was saying, "Accept this deal or we'll bankrupt you fighting legal battles you can't afford." Most names took the settlement because they had no alternative. By 1997, Lloyd's had paid out over $50 billion in asbestos claims, fraud settlements and legal costs. Roughly 10,000 names had been financially destroyed. The marketplace had contracted from 34,000 names to fewer than 2,000. Lloyd's appeared to be in terminal decline. Then they did something radical. They abandoned the name system entirely. I'll expand this chapter with additional detail and narrative depth. In 1994, Lloyd's approved corporate capital, allowing insurance companies to participate as underwriters instead of only wealthy individuals. This was revolutionary. For 308 years, Lloyd's had been individuals risking personal fortunes. Now corporations could participate, bringing capital without unlimited liability. Corporate members risked only their invested capital, not personal assets. The vote to approve corporate capital wasn't unanimous. Traditional names viewed it as betraying Lloyd's founding principles. "We're selling our souls," one veteran underwriter declared at the debate. The entire point of Lloyd's is that men of honor stand behind their word with everything they own. Without unlimited liability, we're just another insurance company. He was right, but irrelevant. Lloyd's needed capital desperately. The asbestos crisis had bankrupted thousands of names and destroyed the market's reputation. No sensible person would join Lloyd's under the old unlimited liability structure. The choice wasn't between tradition and change, it was between change and extinction. The first corporate member was a small Bermuda-based insurer that committed $10 million in 1994. Within months, major insurance corporations were applying. Swiss Re, Munich Re, XL Capital, the giants of global insurance, saw Lloyd's marketplace as an opportunity. They brought not just capital, but expertise in risk modeling, claims management, and regulatory compliance that individual names had never possessed. This change saved Lloyd's. Between 1995 and 2000, dozens of insurance corporations joined Lloyd's, bringing billions in fresh capital. They hired professional underwriters, implemented risk management systems, and operated like modern businesses. The transformation was jarring for old-timers. For 3 centuries, Lloyd's had been a gentleman's club, where underwriters knew each other personally, often for decades. Business was done on handshakes, and trust built over generations. Now, corporate underwriters arrived with spreadsheets, actuarial models, and risk committees that had to approve every decision. It used to be that I could walk up to Harry's box, tell him about a cargo ship sailing to Singapore, and have coverage in 5 minutes, one broker recalled. Now I submit an electronic form that goes to an algorithm, then a risk committee in Zurich, then back to some underwriter I've never met who asks for 17 additional data points. Yes, it's more rigorous. It's also completely soulless. But it was undeniably more stable. Corporate members didn't panic during bad years. They didn't commit suicide when losses mounted. They treated underwriting as a business with acceptable losses rather than a personal catastrophe when things went wrong. By 2000, over 60% of Lloyd's capital came from corporations, not individuals. The remaining individual names were mostly wealthy hobbyists who enjoyed being part of Lloyd's tradition. The era of middle-class doctors and lawyers risking their homes was over. The few remaining individual names were a strange breed. They were almost exclusively multi-millionaires, for whom unlimited liability was more theoretical than threatening. A hedge fund manager worth $200 million could risk $5 million at Lloyd's, knowing that even a catastrophic loss wouldn't destroy him. For these individuals, being a name was a status symbol, like owning a racehorse or joining an exclusive club. They still attended Lloyd's annual dinners, still wore the traditional uniforms at ceremonial events, still talked about the market with reverence. But they were historical reenactors more than real participants. The actual business of Lloyd's was now run by insurance corporations pursuing quarterly earnings targets. The digital transformation happened simultaneously. Lloyd's built a computer network connecting all underwriters, brokers, and claims processors. The old paper slip system, physically walking slips between underwriters to build policy coverage, was replaced with electronic submission and approval. The paper slip system had been absurdly inefficient, but strangely effective. A broker would handwrite policy details on a long paper slip, then physically walk around the Lloyd's building, visiting underwriter after underwriter. Each underwriter would initial the slip and write the percentage of the risk they'd accept. 10% of $500,000 at 3.5% premium, they might write, then sign. The broker would continue until 100% of the risk was covered, sometimes visiting 30 or 40 underwriters for a single policy. It could take days. Complex risks might require multiple trips as underwriters asked questions, requested additional information, or negotiated terms. This system seems insane by modern standards, but it had hidden advantages. Underwriters learned about risks by talking to brokers. They heard about shipping patterns, construction techniques, industry problems. This informal information network made Lloyd's underwriters the best informed in the world. When Lloyd's digitized, all that disappeared. Brokers submitted electronic forms with standardized data fields. Underwriters reviewed submissions on screens, often never speaking to the broker. The human element, the conversation, the negotiation, the transfer of tacit knowledge was eliminated in favor of efficiency. This seems mundane, but it fundamentally changed Lloyd's efficiency. Previously, placing complex insurance could take weeks as brokers physically visited dozens of underwriters. Now it took hours. Lloyd's could respond to market opportunities faster than any competitor. A broker could submit a risk electronically at 9 a.m., receive quotes from 20 underwriters by noon, and have a fully subscribed policy by end of business. What had taken weeks now took hours. What had required dozens of face-to-face meetings now happened via automated systems. For time-sensitive risks, covering a ship that needed to sail the next day, ensuring a film production that was about to start shooting, protecting a satellite launch scheduled for the weekend, this speed was transformative. Lloyd's could capture business that competitors couldn't process fast enough to win. By 2005, Lloyd's had fully digitized operations. Policies were issued electronically. Claims were processed online. Risk data was shared instantly across the marketplace. Lloyd's had transformed from a 300-year-old coffee shop culture into a modern fintech platform. The building itself reflected this change. The famous Lutein bell, traditionally rung to announce ships lost at sea, became a tourist attraction rather than a functional tool. The old wooden underwriting boxes were replaced with modern desks and computer terminals. The ceremonial aspects of Lloyd's, the uniforms, the traditions, the formal dinners, continued, but they were now performance art rather than actual business practice. But modernization created new challenges. Lloyd's competitive advantage had always been relationships and information asymmetry. Underwriters who'd spent decades building knowledge about shipping, aviation, or construction had expertise competitors couldn't match. An underwriter who'd spent 30 years insuring oil tankers knew things that no computer could teach. He knew which ship owners maintained their vessels properly. He knew which routes were genuinely dangerous versus just statistically risky. He knew which captains were competent and which were drunk. This knowledge was worth millions. It allowed Lloyd's to price risks more accurately than anyone else. Digital systems commodified that knowledge. Anyone could access Lloyd's data. Risk models became standardized. The information advantage that had made Lloyd's dominant was disappearing. Worse, the best information was leaving Lloyd's entirely. Google, Amazon, and tech companies were collecting data that made traditional insurance information look primitive. They knew where people drove, what they bought, how they lived. A tech company analyzing smartphone data knew more about individual risk than any traditional underwriter. The information advantage that had made Lloyd's dominant was disappearing. The future of insurance might belong to whoever had the best data, not the most experienced underwriters. Lloyd's response was to focus on complexity. They'd insure risks that computers couldn't price, unique events, novel technologies, and catastrophic scenarios without historical precedent. Let standard insurance companies handle commoditized risks. Lloyd's would dominate the weird stuff. This was a clever strategy, but also an admission of weakness. Lloyd's was essentially saying, we can't compete on normal insurance anymore, so we'll only do the stuff nobody else wants to touch. It was profitable, but precarious. What happens when artificial intelligence gets good enough to price weird risks too? This strategy led to some bizarre policies. Lloyd's insured the 2012 London Olympics against alien invasion. Seriously, a British bookmaker wanted coverage. They insured a coffee company against their mascot being kidnapped. They insured a theme park against discovering real dinosaur DNA. The alien invasion policy was peak Lloyd's absurdity. A British bookmaker had offered odds on extraterrestrial contact during the Olympics and wanted to hedge their exposure. Lloyd's underwriters spent weeks debating how to price the risk of alien invasion. What was the probability? How would you define invasion versus contact? Would a single UFO sighting count, or did aliens need to actually land? They eventually issued the policy for a small premium, figuring the publicity was worth more than the risk. When the Olympics concluded without alien contact, Lloyd's kept the premium and generated worldwide news coverage. It was brilliant marketing disguised as insurance. These novelty policies generated publicity, but weren't profitable businesses. The real money was in complex corporate risks, cyber insurance for Fortune 500 companies, political risk insurance for multinational projects, and casualty insurance for infrastructure megaprojects. Cyber insurance became Lloyd's fastest-growing product line. Companies suddenly realized their entire business could be destroyed by hackers, and traditional insurance didn't cover it. Lloyd's stepped in, creating policies that covered data breaches, ransomware attacks, and system failures. The problem was that nobody really knew how to price cyber risk. There was no historical data. Every company's network was unique. The threat landscape changed monthly. Lloyd's was essentially guessing, educated guessing by smart underwriters, but still guessing. They charged high premiums and hoped they weren't catastrophically wrong. Political risk insurance was equally complex. A mining company investing $2 billion in an African mine wanted coverage against government expropriation, civil war, or regime change. How do you price the risk of revolution? Lloyd's underwriters became amateur political scientists, studying election patterns, ethnic tensions, and economic stability. By 2015, Lloyd's was handling over $50 billion in annual premiums. They'd survived asbestos, scandal, and digital disruption. They'd transformed from an aristocratic club into a modern marketplace. The numbers were impressive, but Lloyd's market share was shrinking. Global insurance premiums totaled over $5 trillion annually. Lloyd's $50 billion was just 1% of the market. They'd gone from dominating global insurance to being a niche player, specializing in complexity and catastrophe. Still, it was a profitable niche. Lloyd's generated consistent returns for corporate members. The drama and financial ruin of the names era seemed like ancient history. Lloyd's had become stable, professional, and slightly boring, exactly what a modern insurance marketplace should be. Then 3 hurricanes hit the United States in 2017, and Lloyd's discovered that climate change was creating risks their historical models couldn't predict. Hurricane Harvey hit Houston in August 2017. Hurricane Irma hit Florida 2 weeks later. Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico 2 weeks after that. Lloyd's total exposure, $14 billion in claims, in 6 weeks. To understand how catastrophic this was, consider that Lloyd's total annual profit in 2016 had been $2.1 billion. 3 storms had just wiped out nearly 7 years of profits in a month and a half. Syndicates that specialized in U.S. property coverage faced losses exceeding their entire capital base. The hurricanes weren't just expensive, they were statistically impossible according to Lloyd's models. The probability of 3 Category 4+ hurricanes hitting the United States in 6 weeks was supposed to be once every 500 years. Lloyd's had priced their premiums accordingly, assuming such clustering was essentially impossible. They were wrong. The hurricanes revealed that Lloyd's climate models were obsolete. They'd been pricing hurricane risk based on 20th century weather patterns, but climate change was making storms more frequent and more severe. Historical data couldn't predict future losses anymore. Underwriters had known climate change was real. They weren't idiots. But they'd underestimated how quickly it would affect hurricane patterns. The warming Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic Ocean were creating conditions for rapid intensification, where storms exploded from Category 1 to Category 5 in hours. Their models, calibrated on decades of historical data, couldn't capture this new reality. Hurricane Harvey dumped 60 inches of rain on Houston in 4 days, a once-in-25,000-year rainfall event according to traditional probability models. Except it happened. Hurricane Maria completely destroyed Puerto Rico's electrical grid and caused $90 billion in total damage, the 3rd costliest tropical cyclone ever recorded. Lloyd's paid every claim, $14 billion within 18 months. But the hurricanes triggered a fundamental rethinking of risk assessment. If historical models were unreliable, how could Lloyd's price future risks? The payment process itself was remarkable. Within days of the hurricanes, Lloyd's had claims adjusters on the ground in Houston, Florida, and Puerto Rico. They processed business interruption claims, property damage assessments, and casualty losses simultaneously. The digitization investments of the early 2000s paid off. Claims that would have taken years to process in the paper era were settled in months. But paying claims wasn't the problem. The problem was, how do you price future hurricane risk when the past is no longer predictive? Some syndicates proposed simply doubling premiums for coastal properties. Others wanted to stop insuring hurricane risk entirely, letting government programs and reinsurers handle it. The answer was machine learning and satellite data. Lloyd's partnered with tech companies to build AI systems that analyzed satellite imagery, weather patterns, and construction quality to predict hurricane damage in real time. Instead of using historical averages, they'd model specific properties in specific storm scenarios. This required massive investment. Lloyd spent over $500 million between 2018 and 2020 building these systems. They hired data scientists from Google and Amazon. They licensed satellite imagery from Planet Labs and synthetic aperture radar data from Capella Space. They built computational models that could simulate hurricane impacts on individual buildings. The technology was genuinely impressive. Give the system a property address and it would analyze building age, construction materials, roof type, elevation above sea level, distance from coast, proximity to flood zones, local drainage systems, building code compliance, and historical maintenance records. Then it would simulate that specific building's response to different hurricane scenarios, Category 3 with 12 inches of rain, Category 5 with storm surge, slow-moving Category 2 with extreme rainfall. The result was property-specific risk pricing. 2 houses on the same street might have wildly different premiums based on construction quality and elevation differences of just a few feet. Homeowners hated this. They wanted simple, predictable pricing, but Lloyd's insisted it was more accurate than old zone-based models. This was Insurance 3.0, moving from actuarial tables to predictive analytics. Lloyd's was betting that better data and better models would restore their competitive advantage. The irony wasn't lost on Lloyd's old-timers. For 3 centuries, Lloyd's advantage had been underwriter judgment, experienced humans who understood risk intuitively. Now their advantage was supposed to be algorithms. The soul of Lloyd's, the human expertise, the tacit knowledge, the relationship-based underwriting, was being replaced by machine learning models that no individual underwriter fully understood. By 2020, Lloyd's was using AI to price roughly 40% of property catastrophe risks. The systems analyzed millions of data points, building materials, elevation, distance from coast, local building codes, to generate property-specific risk assessments. The systems weren't perfect. They couldn't capture everything. An AI might assess two identical houses as equal risks, not knowing that one owner was fastidious about maintenance while the other let everything deteriorate. They couldn't predict human behavior during storms. Who would evacuate early? Who would stay and try to protect their property? Who would make catastrophically bad decisions? But they were better than actuarial tables based on obsolete climate data. And they were improving constantly as they ingested more data from each storm season. Then COVID-19 happened, and Lloyd's faced a claim type they'd never imagined: pandemic business interruption. Thousands of businesses had insurance policies covering lost income if they were forced to close. When governments mandated lockdowns, those businesses filed claims. Lloyd's total exposure was estimated at $10 billion. The scale was stunning. Restaurants, hotels, retail stores, entertainment venues, airlines, essentially every consumer-facing business in the world had simultaneously experienced forced closure. It was the kind of systemic, correlated risk that insurance companies dread. Not a random distribution of independent losses, but everyone claiming at once. But there was a problem. Most policies explicitly excluded pandemics. The virus debate wasn't whether businesses had suffered losses, obviously they had, but whether their policies actually covered pandemic-related closures. The policy language was maddeningly ambiguous. Most business interruption policies covered closures due to physical loss or damage to property. Did a virus constitute physical damage? Some courts said yes. The virus particles were physical contaminants that made premises unsafe. Other courts said no, there was no structural damage, just temporary contamination. Lloyd's fought these claims aggressively. They argued that business interruption required physical damage to property, and a virus didn't qualify. Courts around the world split on this interpretation. Some ruled for Lloyd's, others for policyholders. The legal arguments became bizarrely philosophical. What constitutes physical damage? If a business couldn't operate because customers wouldn't enter for fear of infection, was that physical damage? If government orders forced closure to prevent viral spread, did that trigger coverage? Lloyd's hired armies of lawyers. They fought every claim, appealed every adverse ruling, and sought to establish precedents that would protect them from future pandemic claims. Insurance trade groups called it protecting the industry's solvency. Consumer advocates called it denying claims on technicalities while businesses went bankrupt. Both were right. Lloyd's was technically correct about policy language. Most policies weren't written to cover pandemics, but the optics were terrible. Wealthy insurers refusing to help struggling businesses during a once-in-a-century crisis. By 2024, Lloyd's had paid out roughly $4 billion in COVID claims and was still fighting thousands of lawsuits. The pandemic revealed that insurance policy language, written decades earlier, couldn't anticipate novel catastrophes. The $4 billion payout was less than half what businesses had claimed. Lloyd's had successfully argued that most policies didn't cover pandemics, saving themselves from potentially $50 billion in exposure. But they'd also enraged policyholders who felt betrayed by insurance companies, refusing to honor what seemed like obvious coverage. Small businesses especially felt screwed. They'd paid premiums for years, believing they were covered for forced closures. When closure actually happened, insurers said, "Not this kind of closure." It was technically correct, but felt like fraud. Lloyd's response was to explicitly exclude pandemics from all future policies. No ambiguity, no interpretation debates. If you wanted pandemic coverage, it would be a separate, expensive policy. The new exclusion language was brutally clear. This policy does not cover losses arising from disease, virus, bacteria, or any pandemic declared by the World Health Organization, regardless of any other cause or event contributing concurrently or in any sequence to the loss. This created a market opportunity: pandemic insurance. Several Lloyd's syndicates now offer pandemic business interruption coverage at premiums roughly 5x higher than pre-COVID rates. Some businesses are buying it. Most aren't, gambling that another pandemic won't happen soon. The pandemic policies were expensive for a reason. Nobody knew how to price the risk. COVID-19 had caused unprecedented global business interruption, but was that the worst-case scenario? What if the next pandemic had COVID's contagiousness, with SARS's 10% fatality rate? What if it primarily killed working-age adults instead of the elderly? The honest answer was, nobody knew. Lloyd's was basically saying, we'll cover pandemic risk if you pay us enough that we'll probably make money even if another COVID happens. Most businesses looked at the premiums and decided to self-insure, meaning they just accept the risk and deal with it if another pandemic occurred. Today, Lloyd's of London handles over $60 billion in annual premiums. They employ 50,000 people globally. They've insured SpaceX satellite launches, Amazon's cloud infrastructure against cyber attacks, and pharmaceutical companies against vaccine failure lawsuits. The SpaceX insurance was particularly complex. A satellite launch involves hundreds of millions of dollars in hardware being strapped to a controlled explosion and shot into space. Every launch is unique. Every payload is irreplaceable. There's no statistical model for probability of Falcon 9 rocket explosion during Starlink deployment. Lloyd's underwrites this by combining engineering analysis, launch history, and educated guessing. They charge SpaceX roughly 5–8% of payload value as premium, $10 million to insure a $150 million satellite. If the launch succeeds, which it usually does, Lloyd's keeps the premium. If it fails, they pay the full loss. Amazon's cyber insurance is even more speculative. What's the probability that AWS suffers a catastrophic breach that exposes customer data and causes mass service outages? Nobody knows. Lloyd's charges Amazon tens of millions annually to cover this risk, essentially betting that Amazon's security is good enough that catastrophic breaches won't happen more often than premiums accumulate. Bruce Carnegie Brown, Lloyd's chairman, describes the modern marketplace as capitalism's risk transfer mechanism. When businesses face risks they can't or won't bear, Lloyd's finds someone willing to bet those risks won't materialize. It's an elegant description of a fundamentally weird business. Lloyd's exists because businesses would rather pay someone to worry about catastrophic risks than worry about them themselves. SpaceX could self-insure their launches. They're wealthy enough. But they'd rather pay Lloyd's to absorb the risk, freeing themselves to focus on building rockets. This is what insurance has always been, paying someone else to lose sleep over worst-case scenarios. Lloyd's has been doing this for 338 years, and the fundamental psychology hasn't changed, but the fundamental model hasn't changed since 1686. Wealthy individuals and corporations pledge capital, underwriters assess risks, premiums are collected, claims are paid, the cycle continues. What has changed is scale and sophistication. Edward Lloyd ran his coffee house with paper ledgers and handshake deals. Modern Lloyd's uses AI, satellite data, and blockchain settlement systems. But the core principle, distributed risk assessment by competing underwriters, remains identical. The blockchain experiments are Lloyd's latest modernization attempt. They're building smart contract systems where policies automatically execute and pay claims when predefined conditions are met. A flight delay insurance policy might automatically refund passengers when airline data confirms a delay. A crop insurance policy might automatically pay farmers when satellite data confirms drought. This is called parametric insurance, paying based on measurable parameters rather than actual losses. It eliminates claims adjustment, fraud investigation, and legal disputes. When the trigger event happens, the policy pays automatically. Whether this represents insurance's future or is just another technological fad remains to be seen. Lloyd's is hedging their bets, investing in blockchain while maintaining traditional underwriting operations. The question facing Lloyd's now is whether that 338-year-old model can survive 21st century risks. Climate change, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence failures, and systemic risks that affect entire industries simultaneously. Lloyd's is betting yes. They're investing heavily in catastrophe modeling, expanding into cyber insurance, and developing parametric insurance products that pay automatically when specific conditions are met. But they're also preparing for catastrophic losses. Lloyd's maintains capital reserves of over $40 billion, enough to survive another asbestos-scale crisis. They've implemented stress testing requirements, mandatory risk diversification, and central oversight of syndicate performance. The stress tests simulate nightmare scenarios. Simultaneous Category 5 hurricanes hitting multiple U.S. cities, magnitude 9.0 earthquakes in Tokyo and Los Angeles, global cyber attacks disrupting financial systems, pandemics worse than COVID-19. Lloyd's requires syndicates to demonstrate they could survive any two of these events happening simultaneously. This is unprecedented caution for an industry built on calculated risk-taking. But Lloyd's learned from the names crisis. Catastrophic losses don't just threaten profitability, they threaten survival. Better to be overcapitalized and stable than optimal and vulnerable. The unlimited liability system that nearly destroyed Lloyd's in the 1980s still exists, but only for a small number of individual names. Most capital comes from corporations with limited liability. Lloyd's has essentially become a hybrid, traditional marketplace structure with modern corporate protections. Whether this hybrid can survive the next crisis remains uncertain. Climate change could generate hurricane losses exceeding $100 billion in a single season. A major cyber attack could cause global business interruption claims in the trillions. A pandemic worse than COVID could overwhelm every insurance market simultaneously. Lloyd's is betting they can price these risks accurately enough to collect premiums that exceed claims over time. That's what they've done for 338 years. Why would the next 338 be different? The honest answer, maybe they will be different. The risks Lloyd's faces today are different in kind, not just degree, from historical risks. Climate change isn't a random event. It's a systematic shift in baseline conditions. Cyber warfare isn't an isolated loss. It's a correlated global threat. AI failures won't affect one company. They'll cascade through interconnected systems. Insurance has always assumed that risks are somewhat independent and randomly distributed. But 21st century risks are correlated and systemic. When one thing fails, everything fails. Lloyd's entire model depends on diversification, spreading risk across many independent policies. If the policies aren't truly independent, diversification doesn't work. Lloyd's knows this. They're adapting. But whether they can adapt fast enough, whether their 338-year-old structure is flexible enough for 21st century catastrophes, remains an open question. For now, Lloyd's survives. Underwriters still assess risks. Premiums still flow in. Claims are still paid. The coffee house Edward Lloyd opened in 1686 has become a $60 billion global marketplace. But the basic transaction, someone betting that catastrophe won't happen, someone else betting it will, remains unchanged. So we've seen how a coffee shop became a $50 billion empire. It wasn't vision. It wasn't planning. It was accidental evolution. Edward Lloyd opened a coffee shop near the docks. Merchants started making bets. Those bets became standardized contracts. Those contracts became a marketplace. That marketplace became an institution that survived wars, scandals, and catastrophic claims. The Lloyd story is ultimately about distributed risk assessment. Instead of one corporation deciding what to insure, hundreds of independent underwriters make individual choices. Some are brilliant, some are idiots. The market rewards accuracy and punishes error. The institution evolves through natural selection. This model survived 338 years because it's anti-fragile. When disaster strikes, individual underwriters can fail without destroying the marketplace. When fraud happens, it's contained to specific syndicates. When new risks emerge, some underwriters experiment while others wait for data. Traditional insurance companies can't match this adaptability. They're bureaucracies with centralized decision-making. If executives make bad choices, the entire company suffers. Lloyd's distributes both authority and risk, making catastrophic failure less likely. The real lesson here isn't about insurance, it's about institutional design. Lloyd's created a system where individual failure strengthens the collective. Underwriters who mispriced risks went bankrupt, teaching others what to avoid. Successful underwriters trained successors, propagating effective strategies. This is evolution applied to capitalism, and it's why Lloyd's outlasted every competitor from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. They didn't optimize for short-term profits. They optimized for long-term survival through distributed experimentation. Whether we like it or not, This model works for uncertainty management. When facing risks without historical precedent, pandemics, climate change, cyber warfare, distributed assessment beats centralized planning. Nobody knows the right answer, so let hundreds of smart people make different bets and see what works. Lloyd's has nearly collapsed 3 times. Asbestos almost killed them. Fraud almost destroyed their reputation. Hurricanes almost broke their capital reserves. Each time, they survived by adapting, abandoning unlimited liability for individuals, implementing digital systems, improving risk models. So the question remains, can a 338-year-old institution designed for insuring wooden sailing ships survive 21st century existential risks? Lloyd's think so. They're betting their entire business model that distributed risk assessment can price anything: climate catastrophe, cyber apocalypse, even artificial intelligence risk. Whether that bet pays off won't be clear for decades. But here's what we know. Every insurance company that competed with Lloyd's in 1686 is gone. Every 18th century maritime insurer is extinct. Every 19th century innovation that was supposed to replace Lloyd's failed. Lloyd's is still here, still insuring weird risks, still convincing wealthy people to bet on disasters, still operating in a building in London where merchants meet to gamble on catastrophes. That persistence isn't luck. It's institutional design that prioritizes survival over optimization. And in a world of accelerating change and unprecedented risks, maybe the 338-year-old coffee shop model is exactly what we need.